Ladies and gentlemen, I'd first of all like to start off by thanking Dr. Lahi and Dr. Mazzoui for the wonderful introduction, and particularly for Dr. Lahi for the very kind comments. I also feel extremely privileged and honored to be here with you at the United Nations to be able to announce the launch of the Human Consciousness Project of the School of Medicine of the University of Southampton, as well as the AWARE study, and make you informed about the research that is about to start here in the United States, as well as across many centers in Europe, which we believe that will potentially have huge implications not only for science, but also for the whole of society and humankind. Therefore, really as a representative of the more than 30 collaborators who are working with me currently in different medical centers both in Europe and the United States, I would like to sincerely thank everybody. I'm going to start off my presentation by giving a brief introduction about the whole subject of consciousness and the mind-body problem, which will then lead on to the research that we have established. Okay. So the title of my talk is Unraveling the Mystery of the Self, from Descartes to the Human Consciousness Project. I'm going to start off by really giving an introduction to the whole subject of what is the self, talking about the problem of consciousness, and then really talking about the challenge that we have currently in science, both neuroscience and in general really in the 21st century, as well as then leading on to the research that has been developed through the University of Southampton and that I'm very happy to be able to announce today. I just wanted to really start off by bringing a particular point home to everybody here, and forgive me if everyone is aware of this, but to many people that I've discussed, sometimes I get the question, well, who cares? Why does it matter to know about the self? Why does it matter to know about consciousness? And I think a key thing that we should all remember today, before we go through both this presentation as well as the panel discussions at hand, is that the self and consciousness is really who we are. It's everything that makes us into who we are. It's our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, everything that lies within that intimate part that we're in connection with all the time, and that we delve into when we have any issues with ourselves, but also that we connect to society with. For example, right now, I'm a thinking being and I'm talking to you, and as an audience, we're communicating through our consciousness. And really, this consciousness begins from the time that we're born, as you can see here, as we're delivered. And it continues to grow as we develop through our childhood, through our interactions with our family, and eventually really as we evolve into mature adults throughout society. And eventually, if we look back on our lives and think about what has happened to us, we can see that really we are our collection of our thoughts, memories, and consciousness. And that really is important because it affects everything we do in our lives, whether it be our relationships, whether it be our education, whether it be our social progress. And for some people who are interested in development on a personal basis, how we develop as human beings also. And therefore, it's very important that we develop a science that tells us what this is. And as Dr. Lahi pointed out, so far this has really been considered an issue for philosophy. But to many people, including myself and many of our colleagues, there's no reason why this should not be addressed by the objective means of science. And just to highlight this point, when you enjoy a beautiful painting, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, if you listen to beautiful music, if you're engaged in science, if you're engaged in justice, if you're engaged in religion, whatever you're engaged in, everything that you do, everything that we all do, takes place through consciousness. It's through our mind and consciousness that everything takes place. Yet, we know very little about this magical phenomena from a scientific point of view. And we also notice that when we look at human beings and compare to other beings on Earth, animals, we see that we also have unique features that we cannot really explain scientifically. We have reasoning and rational thought that other animals don't have, even though biologically we're very similar. We have the ability to create. This building itself is an example of that. We have free will. We're also interested in moral behavior and ethics, and in many cases the exploration of the divine, which is something that isn't seen in other beings. We also show, in many cases, human beings show the wonderful virtue of transcendent behavior, where we're able to overcome our instincts and go against what would be natural to our other animals that exist on Earth, whereas human beings can really overcome that and do amazing feats. They can sacrifice their own interests for the interests of others. And interestingly, from a scientific point of view, when we examine the human brain, of course, we're not so different to primates or any other animal within the animal kingdom. Yet, what is it that makes the human mind and consciousness so unique? Why is it that human beings, the ability to develop is infinite? And these are some of the questions that, of course, we don't yet have the answers for, but we'd like to be able to understand better. Now, of course, the whole subject of consciousness and interest in understanding who we are isn't something that started in 2008 at the United Nations in New York. Of course, this is an age-old question that goes back probably as far back as mankind, as humankind itself. Certainly we know in Western society that the roots really go back to the classical Greece. And this is an area that's been really debated and studied for millennia now, since at least the time of the Greeks. And we know that from the time of Homer, at least at that time, the concept of the self, or as they called it, the soul, had really evolved into a specific meaning. And it was something that applied to all living beings, and it really to be alive. It was what gives people life, it's what gives us our existence, and it accounts for all the vital functions of living beings. And this is what the concept was in ancient Greece. And we know that by the time of Socrates, that the concept of the self, or the soul as was called, had really had developed itself into, as I said, a distinguishing mark of all living beings. And it was the subject of all emotional states, responsible for all our mental and psychological functioning, our thoughts, our perceptions, our desires, our planning, and it was also the bearer, or considered to be the bearer, of all moral virtues. So really, everything that we consider who we are. And this is interesting because I often get asked the question, is this something to do with the soul? And of course, it's not something you can answer in a brief sort of 2-minute discussion. But you see that the whole concept of the soul really began as the concept of the self. Who are we? What is it that gives us life? Now, of course, this interest has carried on from those times and has been discussed, I think, really, it's true to say, in all civilizations. It's been addressed by many different philosophers and scholars, and is commonly referred to as the mind-body problem. And essentially, the mind-body problem really is a problem, because the question that we have, and philosophers before us have also had, is how does this amazing phenomena of thought and consciousness arise from bodily processes? We know that, of course, our body has cells and has organs, but how do thoughts come to be? And this is something that I'll address a little bit more in detail. But essentially, if you summarize in just a few seconds here, because of time is very brief, if you look at the views that are out there, they can be really categorized into two broad thoughts. One is that essentially, somehow, thoughts and consciousness must arise from our bodily processes, and that's called the monist view. The other is that somehow mind and body must be separate, because mind, consciousness, thoughts are so amazingly different to the rest of our body that they must be a different entity. And of course, this dualist view is a view that's been proposed by many people, whether it be Plato, Aristotle, and probably the most famous person that's been referred to in Western philosophy is René Descartes, who firmly believed that the mind is separate to the body and actually interacts with the body through this small gland in the brain called the pineal gland. And if we look back, obviously, through the few hundreds and thousands of years, it's only in fairly recent times that there has been any real sort of objective way or to try to study this. And in fact, it was towards the end of the 19th century that the whole science, or the subject of psychology, was formed, which also took on an interest in this mind-body problem. And thankfully, in more recent times, over the last 30 or 40 or so years maximum, there's also been an interest that's developed by the scientific community to try to answer this question, which had always been perceived to be philosophical. I must point out that still the numbers of scientists who are engaged in this area of research and fascinating are still very small, but nevertheless it's very welcoming and very good that science has also taken on an interest in trying to solve this mystery of the mind and consciousness. And in fact, in the scientific literature, we now refer to the mind-body problem as the problem of consciousness. Now, this wonderful gentleman, who's here smiling, very happy and content with himself because he's at the United Nations. Somehow he brought a mirror along with himself too, just to enjoy his beautiful face. He's here looking at himself, and he's wondering, who am I? What is it that makes me into the unique being that I am? And this really is the crux of the whole discussion about what is consciousness. What is it that makes each and every single one of us as individuals who we are? Now, this problem of consciousness that I just referred to really can be summarized into trying to understand how we can have consciousness that arises from brain processes. In other words, how do all our subjective thoughts, feelings, emotions, everything else that makes us unique arise from brain cells? Now, again, forgive me if this is clear to everybody in the audience. Certainly from my point of view, I had made an assumption as a doctor that this was all completely understood, and I assumed that everything comes from the brain. When I was first challenged with this concept, I was really taken aback. I was like, well, isn't it completely understood that the brain generates all your thoughts? There shouldn't be a discussion about this. And it was only when I started to look at the literature and really study in detail that I realized there's a huge problem in science. And it can be shown really probably more graphically for you. If you were to look at the brain as a global organ, and here we have a picture of the brain, and if I were to tell you, well, somehow through this amazing grey organ that has billions of cells connected together, you also have thoughts and consciousness arising, you'd probably say to me, well, oh, that's interesting, but how? Well, we don't know obviously where inside the whole of brain organ this arises. But if we were to then cut through a section of the brain and look at the various tracts, as you can see over there, that connects the nerves together, the question arises, well, where does that arise? Where do thoughts come from? And again, we don't have an answer to that. If we were to go down and look in more detail at the individual cells that make up the brain, that are connected together with all this electricity, a bit like a mesh of wire, the question still arises, how do thoughts arise? So if I were to show a brain cell to anybody here down a microscope and tell you, well, you know what, this brain cell is thinking, I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or I'm annoyed, or I'm happy, you'd probably think I was a little bit crazy. Because obviously you'd say, well, this is a brain cell, and like any other cell, it produces proteins and it produces electricity. So why should it somehow generate this amazing thing called thought? Okay, well, obviously we don't accept that individual brain cells can generate thoughts. But then, if we were to connect two of these cells together, or 100, or 1,000,000, with a bit of electricity, where do thoughts come from? Why should they suddenly generate this amazing thing like thought? And that really is the crux of the problem of consciousness. Where do our thoughts come from? Because we need our thoughts, we interact with our thoughts, yet we have no idea where they come from, and how they come to be, and how they interact with the brain cells. Now again, as I pointed out earlier, of course this is not a new problem. This is something that goes back at least the time of the Greeks, if not before. They considered it the human soul, which is really what we now refer to as the self. Descartes had the concept that they are separate from each other. And then what we find is that through the 19th and 20th century, there were numerous studies carried out where we tried to localize different areas of the brain that mediate different aspects of our consciousness. So if you stimulate different parts of the brain, you'll be able to see what becomes active, and I'm sure this is something that will be discussed in detail throughout the panel discussions. And in more modern times, we've used various imaging, looking at the brain under certain circumstances when people have different thoughts, happiness, sadness, etc., and to see which parts of the brain become involved. But identifying those areas of the cells of the brain that become active doesn't tell us anything about how those thoughts come to be. So if you were to look at this scan here, you can see that when we have thoughts, for example, if any of us were to be placed in a scanner right now, multiple areas of the brain become active. And so there is a connection between different parts of the brain through electricity that allows us to mediate our thoughts. Yet, just because what we see here is that there's increased activity of brain cells where they're highlighted in orange, doesn't tell us, just because the cells are more active, how they could generate thoughts. It still doesn't answer the fundamental question of why should a bit of chemistry or a bit of electricity generate this amazing phenomena of thought, other than just to say that activity of those cells correlates with our thoughts, but doesn't tell us about how it causes it, if at all. And again, reviewing the literature, we see that this is something that's discussed more and more now in scientific journals, whether journals that are predominantly for sort of a scientific audience or a lay audience. And it really is, there's an edition here from Scientific American from about 10 years ago. But if you were to review the literature and try to summarize what the different thoughts are, not only is there currently no scientific explanation for how thoughts could arise that has been tested and validated through any experimental study, but you see that essentially the views are very much based upon, to some extent, even personal opinions. And essentially they come into two. There are a group of people who I've referred here as conventional theory, that they believe that although we have no idea how brain cells could generate thoughts, that somehow it is brain cells that generate it. And different areas have been proposed to account for this within the brain, or different components of how the brain is put together. And I've put a number of the sort of more well-known proponents of this view on this slide that you can see. Now, other scientists have concluded that, it's really impossible for us to account for thoughts through a bit of electricity or chemistry, and therefore they've come up with different theories. And one theory, and I'm very privileged to say that Professor Stapp is here in the audience, who is a physicist and a quantum physicist, I should say, with an interest in this area and a great deal of expertise, can shed more light on this at the panel discussions. But essentially a group of people have suggested that, okay, maybe it isn't something that's happening at the large scale of the brain with cells connecting together. Maybe it's a phenomenon that we have to discover if we delve really to the really subatomic, below the level of atoms, to try to understand how thoughts and consciousness may arise. Again, people who criticize this say, well, that just takes the level. You go from a higher level to a low level of the structure, but it still doesn't explain how thoughts could arise through quantum processes. There are others who propose that maybe the human mind and consciousness should be considered as a separate, undiscovered entity, something that is scientific but isn't yet understood through the processes that we understand about the brain. And that's a potentially interesting theory that I will discuss a bit more as well as we go along. So at this point, we really don't have any answers. Just to highlight one of the more conventional views here, just to show you, is a theory put forward by Professor Greenfield of the University of Oxford, a very well-known scientist in this area. And her theory is that when we become conscious about something, at any one point within our brain, and you can see there is a large circle and a small circle. The large circle represents a large number, maybe millions or billions of brain cells that are active at the same time. And when a group of cells become active together in the millions or billions, then that allows whatever that phenomena was to come to our mind and our consciousness. However, at the same time, there are other cells that are becoming activated on a smaller scale, maybe hundreds of thousands. And you can see that by the smaller. And the inputs for this are various visual things, sensory stimuli, chemical hormones that go into our body. Nevertheless, at some point, a group of cells become larger and they overtake the other group. And so that's how our consciousness changes. But the key question, and she summarized it very well herself, is that this still does not account for how the mind could arise. So she says, just how the water is turned into wine, how the bump and grind of the neurons, or brain cells, and the shrinking and expanding of assemblies actually translate into subjective experience is, of course, another story completely that we don't have an answer for. So the conventional theories really cannot answer how this comes to be. And a number of problems with the assumption that everything comes from brain cells are highlighted here. First of all, we still can't explain how subjective experience arises, and I've explained that in detail. The other problem is, how is it that many millions of things that are going on inside the brain at any one time suddenly become organized into this one sense of self? Why is it from the billions of inputs that we get at any moment, we suddenly become aware of who we are? I become Sam Parnia. Why should that suddenly happen? And then things that we're not conscious of, so if I have a surge of various hormones, or if I feel hungry, or things that I'm not aware of, then suddenly turn into my awareness and consciousness. How does that happen? And probably most important of all, how does free will arise? We are all beings with free will, and we're judged in society based upon our actions that comes about as a consequence of free will. If we consider that everything is produced directly from brain cell activity, then of course there should be no role for free will in society. And if I were to throw a brick at my neighbor's window, then I should not be held accountable. And certainly the United Nations should not be holding any government or anybody else accountable for anything they do, because it wasn't they who did it, it was their brain cells. Thankfully, that's not the case. Would you agree? So, we have a problem. It's really a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? We know that the mind and the brain interact very closely, but which one comes first? Is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the mind or the brain? Which one's activating which? We don't know right now. And this really leads me on to talking about the research that we're conducting, because I think that a particular area of study that's come about over the last few years may hold the key, and I hope, and I say again, may hold the key to making this discovery about the relationship between the mind, consciousness, and the brain. And that is specifically studying what happens to the mind and consciousness, as well as the brain, during clinical death. Now, a point I'd like to just raise here, and just to start off the discussion, is that although many people, and the common perception in society, is that death is a moment. If you watch Hollywood films, the hero is like, no, no, go, go, I'll follow you, and then he just goes, and then he's dead, right? But I have to point out, in real life, that's not the case. Thankfully, we have Hollywood, and that's not what really happens. Death is defined, and we diagnose people with death really, when three criteria are met. When there's no heartbeat, when there's no breathing, and the brain stops functioning. So many of you have seen that in hospitals we shine a light on the pupils, on the eyes, and we look to see if that reflex is gone. If that reflex goes, that tells us that the brainstem, the area that keeps us alive, has stopped functioning, as has the rest of the brain. So when those three criteria are met, that means somebody is dead. But think about it for a moment. Now, when that happens, of course, many different things can lead to that happening. You could have a heart attack, you could have a stroke, you could have had a car accident, you could have severe infections. Some kind of process eventually, and you can see that by the pyramid, leads to that final point where the heart stops beating and you reach that point of death. But what happens to your body at that time? Well, we know that because there's a lack of blood flow into the brain at that moment, there are changes that take place almost immediately to the brain cells. Now, if there's no blood getting into the brain for a few minutes, then those changes start to lead to permanent changes that become damaging to the cells. And so you start to go through a phase where the cells become more and more damaged, and this can go on for a period of time. But if you think about it, they go through what we call cell death. And this process, again, look at it more globally. What happens to us when we die? Well, the body eventually decomposes. So the cells start to go through change immediately, and ultimately it culminates in this decomposition when we are nothing. So a question that arises, of course, and this process goes on over hours and days, is what happens to the human mind and consciousness at that point, right? So we know that the heart stops beating, but at what point does our mind and consciousness cease functioning? Is it immediate, as soon as the heart stops? Is it for a few seconds? Is it for a few minutes? Is it for a few hours? Who knows? We have no idea about what happens to the human mind and the self at that time. But what we do know is that at the early phase, because the damage is not extensive, potentially we can bring people back to life. And this could be for a few seconds, tens of minutes, maybe even over an hour of time. And that's why we perform cardiac arrest resuscitation. We try to bring people back to life. So if we can get a group of people back to life, what they experience during that first few minutes, maybe even over an hour of time, gives us a unique window of understanding into what we will all experience during death. Because death and cardiac arrest are really synonymous. We call it a cardiac arrest when we try to resuscitate somebody. We press on their chest, we give them shock, we give them drugs. And when we don't succeed, we say the person is dead. If we don't intervene, we say the person was dead. So it's really the same thing. A cardiac arrest is defined by no heartbeat, no activity of the breathing, no activity of the lungs. And studies have shown that within about 10 seconds, the brain also stops functioning. You cannot measure any electricity within the brain at that time. Now, interestingly, over the last 30 years, and it's wonderful that we have Professor Bruce Greyson here, who really is probably, in my opinion, the world's leading expert on near-death experiences here. There have been reports of people who've had these unusual experiences when they've come close to death, what we call a near-death experience. People have typically described feeling very peaceful, feeling joyous, seeing a bright light, seeing deceased relatives, going to a very beautiful place, sometimes even having a panoramic review of their entire lives. Now, the problem with this, although it's very interesting from a scientific point of view, is that they're very vague. What do we mean by near death? What does it mean? Except to say that people do seem to have very interesting, unusual experiences when they've been close to death. And because it's been so vague throughout the last couple of, I should say maybe 10, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of controversy about this. So this has led a number of researchers like myself and Professor Greyson and a number of others around the world to try to study this, what happens to the mind and consciousness, objectively at the point of death. In other words, cardiac arrest. Not near death, but at the point of death. And so we've started to study this in this particular model, which is the same as death, as I mentioned to you. And interestingly, a number of studies carried out by different researchers, one by myself, one by Professor Greyson, and a couple of other people, have shown that about 10 to 20% of people who have gone through clinical death, been brought back to life, will report lucid, well-structured thought processes with reasoning and memory formation. And interestingly, a subgroup of those people will also tell us precisely what we were doing. So although that experience is very subjective, and we cannot study it scientifically as such, a group of them come back and say, I was at the ceiling, and I could see Dr. Smith, he walked into the room, and they can tell us exactly what we were doing, what we were saying. And those details have been, when you speak to the medical and nursing staff, have been validated by the people who were there. And so really it's led to a scientific paradox, because it appears that we have consciousness present when there is no activity of the brain. And I think this will have huge implications for solving the mind-body problem. And just to illustrate this to you, if you look at studies that have been carried out by other researchers looking at the brain during cardiac arrest, during clinical death, as you'd expect, even when we try to bring people back to life. Whoops, we obviously have Wi-Fi here. We'll surf the web afterwards. But we see that as the heartbeat goes down, as the blood pressure drops and people are about to die, you actually, that's what you see, the tracing over there is electrical activity of the brain, and you can see towards the end on the right that you get a flat line. So you get a flat line of brain activity during a cardiac arrest, during clinical death, as you'd expect. And interestingly, this continues even when we as physicians, as a critical care physician, in my case, I do this very commonly, try to revive the heart, try to restart the heart. We give drugs, we shock the heart, etc. And actually, electricity really starts back after the heart has been restarted. And in some cases, not for an hour or two afterwards. And so the big question is, how can you have thought processes? How can people really be conscious when there is no electrical activity of the brain? Well, there are three possible explanations. One is that all these reports may potentially be unreal. Maybe people are just making them up. But it's very unlikely, because if you think about it, there are thousands and thousands of cases people out there. I myself have interviewed over 500 people. My colleague, Dr. Peter Fenwick, has interviewed over 3,000 people. And that's just our small group. I'm sure Professor Grayson has interviewed many others as well. So it's difficult to say that there's a mass conspiracy across the whole world, everyone's sort of making up these stories. So the other possibility is that maybe consciousness is happening just before or just before the brain has stopped functioning, or just after the brain has come back online. Or maybe we have to readdress our views about the relationship between mind and brain. Now, although it's a very valid argument to discuss maybe consciousness was happening just before or just after the actual flatlining of the brain, the problem with that is, though, that we have cases where people have discussed and told us in detail what had happened to them, say, 20 or 30 minutes into a cardiac arrest, when indeed all our studies demonstrate that there is no brain activity. And so you cannot really account for that. And in addition, when people have any disorder of the brain, it leads to an acute confusional state. They become delirious. Whereas in this case, people have very lucid, well-structured thought processes. They have, in a sense, heightened consciousness. And another feature that's also unique is that when there's any insult to the brain, we lose memory. So typically, if someone's about to be hit by a car, they may remember seeing a car coming towards them. But afterwards, they remember nothing of the car actually hitting them, and for a period of time afterwards when they're in hospital, because there's been an insult to the brain. Yet in this case, we have a situation where the brain has been so severely traumatized, and there's no blood getting into the brain, as you'd imagine, that there is no electricity being generated. Yet somehow, amazingly, these people have very clear memories of what was going on, and they can tell us 20, 30 years afterwards. So this has led us to develop the AWARE study, and AWARE stands for Awareness During Resuscitation. And I'm very pleased to be able to announce this international study at this international venue, this very prestigious international venue. It is currently the world's largest ever study of clinical death, trying to address what happens to the human mind and brain during. Our aim is really to answer the questions that I have raised already with you here. And one of the most unique aspects of this study is that we will be testing the claims that people have of being able to see and hear during cardiac arrest. So there are currently two possibilities. We know that this happens. Maybe, as many scientists have proposed, this must be a false memory. It must be some kind of illusion. It must be a trick of the mind. Or, as the people themselves claim, they feel it's very real. As a group of scientists, we have no idea what's correct and what's not. But the only way we can answer this question is to do the objective tests. And as I'll show you later, the only way to do this is to have things around the resuscitation areas, around hospitals, pictures that are only visible from the ceiling. So if somebody really claims they're at the ceiling, then in theory they should see those pictures too. If they're not able to be there and it's a false memory, then of course they won't be able to see them. We're also the first study to adapt very sophisticated technology using the INVOS system that's produced by Somonetics. It's a particular device that measures brain oxygen levels to show in individual cases whether their brain really wasn't functioning or not. Because as you can imagine, although I can tell you that numerous studies in humans and animals have shown that there is no brain function, I cannot tell you that that individual person who had the ability to see or hear or have consciousness somehow didn't have brain activity. So in order to be able to tell what's going on to the brain and how it relates to the mind, we're using this technology that you place a sensor on the brain and it tells you what's happening in terms of blood flow into the brain. I'm pleased to say that we've already piloted this over the last 18 months at 5 centres in the United Kingdom, where I originally set this study up through the University of Southampton. And we've managed to refine the methodology, and we're very pleased to now tell you that it has expanded to 25 centres in Europe and here in the United States. And we hope that throughout this collaboration we can recruit 1,500 people who've had a cardiac arrest and survived to see what happens to their mind, consciousness and brain. We aim to conclude the study within about 36, maybe maximum 60 months from now. And also this study is complemented by another study, the BRAIN-1 study, which stands for Brain Resuscitation Advancement International Network. And this is looking purely on the other spectrum, looking at how we can improve management of cardiac arrest, how we can improve the outcome for our patients, how we can make sure that those who survive do not end up with either cognitive deficits or brain neurological deficits. So it really is a spectrum that goes from purely cardiac arrest research and bringing people back to life to understanding what happens to the mind-body problem and consciousness. And here's a picture just to show you how this is being set up in the UK right now. This is my colleague Nikki Fallowfield at the University of Southampton, who is a resuscitation officer that I work with. And you can see that above the bed we have placed a shelf, and underneath the shelf you can see a symbol. And the idea with this is that if a patient is lying in that bed, and that's on a monitored area, if a patient comes onto that bed and has a cardiac arrest and is brought back to life, and then comes back and tells us that they could see everything the doctors and nurses were doing, we want to find out whether they really could see things and how they could see it. So one possibility, of course, is that they may open their eyes, so therefore we have a symbol underneath the head, and if they were to open their eyes and look up, then they'd see the symbol. On the other hand, on the reverse side, which you cannot see, facing towards the ceiling, there is a much more complex image. And the idea being that will they be able to identify that? So if we get 200 or 300 people who claim to have seen everything, and none of them can identify any of these symbols or images, then that tells us this was simply a false memory. It's an illusion. If, on the other hand, they come back and they say, well, they all say, oh, I saw the triangle, then maybe that suggests that they somehow opened their eyes, and that's how they were able to gather information when they were being revived back to life. And if somehow, again, something out for scientifically at this point, but we have to be open-minded. If somehow people come back and tell us they saw those complex images in 200 or 300 cases, then of course that will revolutionize our scientific understanding of the mind-body problem. And it would suggest that maybe the mind and consciousness is a separate, undiscovered scientific entity, something that can separate from the body and the brain and can continue to function when there is no brain activity. And for future purposes, we'd obviously like to go into more high-tech versions. Here's another colleague of mine, Ken Spearpoint, at Hammersmith Hospitals and Imperial College in London. And the ideal way that we'd like to do this, especially if we do get maybe some positive results, is to adapt this methodology even further. And as you can see from the image on the right, there's a tripod with a tablet PC. We'd have a random image generator, something that would change images randomly every 10 minutes, such that nobody could ever know about what they were. And we'd also ideally like to use a camera that would record exactly what the image was at that precise time, and also record what was happening to the patient down below. So if the patient comes back and tells us that Dr. Smith ran across the bed and hit a bucket of instruments and they fell on the ground, we'd capture that, and we could see if that really did happen. So this is for the future, and we'd like to develop into that as well. And just also to show you this.
It's 5 o'clock.
Right, that's part of our study too. I apologize for the terribly handsome gentleman who's in the background. Just ignore that aspect of it. But you can see that this is a setup that we have developed, and the idea would be that we'd have a tablet PC with, say, a picture of a baby, something that a patient would not have known about, would not expect to see in a hospital, and will they be able to tell us about that? And if they do, maybe I'll look with a smile on my next picture that you see. So, and just to finish off, I'll tell you a little bit about the Human Consciousness Project. And the AWARE is the first study of the Human Consciousness Project of the University of Southampton. I'm delighted to say that 2 of our collaborators are here right now, Professor Bruce Grayson and Dr. Mario Beauregard, and you'll be able to listen to them and ask any questions during the panel discussions. And there are various other people who are not, unfortunately, able to be here today. But it's an international multidisciplinary consortium of scientists and physicians who are interested in the problem of consciousness. And we aim to really research the nature of consciousness and its relationship with the brain and neuronal, in other words, brain cell processes, and that mediate to the different aspects and different facets of our consciousness. The expertise that lies within the group is very diverse because we feel that it's an important subject that needs people with different areas of expertise. So you can see we have experts from critical care and resuscitation, psychiatry. We have people who are experts on near-death experiences, neuroscience, neuroimaging, emergency medicine, immunology, molecular biology, all different aspects that will have implications for different studies that we do. And just to mention here very briefly, there is another study that I would have liked to have been able to mention here today, but hasn't yet got off the ground, but Dr. Beauregard is pioneering this at the University of Montreal. It's a complementary study, and it's looking at what happens to the human mind and consciousness during a particular kind of surgery called deep hypothermic surgery. This is a surgery which is carried out very infrequently, relatively, in people who have specific brain and heart operations. And what they do, doctors will cool the patients down to 18 degrees Celsius, and as a consequence, they cause the brain activity to cease, so you get a flat line of the brain. Now, anecdotally, we've had people report out-of-body experiences. We've had people report the ability to see and recall the details of what had happened to them. And so what he has developed is a wonderful collaboration with the cardiothoracic unit at the University of Montreal to develop a study to test the claims that people have of being able to see and hear during this particular kind of surgery, and he'll be using random image generators and computers and possibly with cameras to record exactly what was happening. And hopefully that will be announced in the next few months. And I think my final slide here is just to highlight again the Human Consciousness Project. It really is a broad global collaboration. We have numerous people involved with this, and the aim is, at least for the AWARE study, to recruit at least 1,500 cardiac arrest survivors and to do different kinds of studies. Some of them are short-term, looking at either improving outcomes for our patients, but also addressing the whole mind-body problem. And then some of them are more long-term. How can we improve the psychological outcomes of people who've gone through cardiac arrest? And I think it's something that I hope will be starting now, but will be going on for many months, and the collaboration will continue to grow. The current collaborators who we're working with are here on the slide. You can see our US and UK collaborators. We also have one site in Austria, although we do hope to get more centers in mainland Europe. And we've now reached our target of 25 centers, although we're open to more collaborators, of course. And I'd like to just end with a special thank you to the Noor Foundation for organizing this wonderful symposium and to allow us the opportunity to announce the commencement of both AWARE and the Human Consciousness Project of the University of Southampton, as well as, of course, the NGO section of the United Nations and the University of Montreal for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you very much.